So Dr. Sarah McGrath is the Threatened Species Index Project Officer at the NCRIS Enabled Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network, TERN, which we all know, at Uni of Queensland. Sarah works with data providers to incorporate their data into the index and to generate up-to-date and reliable trends in abundance and occurrence. And she's just acknowledging her co-authors, Talia Laurie and Jeffrey Hurd. And Sarah's going to talk about how are Australian threatened and near-threatened plants faring, looking at the latest release of the Threatened Species Index. And I think there's some brochures outside as well from your project, Sarah.
They look like this. Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, hi everyone. So I'm just going to start with a quick acknowledgement of country, and specifically I want to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yuggera peoples of the land on which this research was conducted. I honour their profound connections to land, water, biodiversity and culture, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. All right, so first up, what is this Threatened Species Index? So it is a database of thousands of monitoring projects from across Australia on threatened species or near threatened species in Australia. In the right-hand corner here, I have an example of the kind of data that we collate, which is time series data. So this is where abundance has been measured at the same location using the same methods over multiple years. And when I say a threatened or near threatened species, this is according to the EPBC Act or IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. So we work with people from government, NGOs, academia, and collect this monitoring data. We then use this to create an index, so a quantitative index that measures the changes in abundance of these species over time. And so we actually release this index at the end of each year. So on the bottom right here, I have the release of the 2023 index. This is for all taxonomic groups in the index, so birds, mammals, and plants. So the index will start at a value of 1, which is there. So in this case, the reference year is 1985. So there'll be a value, index value of 1 at the reference year. Any value greater than 1 indicates an average increase in abundance compared to that reference year. Any value less than 1 indicates a decrease in abundance compared to that reference year. So in 2020, the index value was 0.38, which indicates there's been a 62% decline, average decline in the abundance of threatened and near-threatened species in Australia since 1985. All right, so how is the Threatened Species Index used? So it's become the country's objective measure for change in threatened and near-threatened species through time. It was featured in the latest State of the Environment report. Last year, the Australian Government's Treasury Department released its Measuring What Matters framework, and it listed the index as its key metric for its biological diversity indicator. It has also been adopted by the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water, who's also been a major partner of the index. So it's been built into their corporate reporting as a way for the department to measure the effectiveness of their conservation actions and policies. All right, so just a brief quick timeline here. So the Threatened Species Index started as the Threatened Bird Index at the Nest Threatened Species Recovery Hub in collaboration with BirdLife Australia. While it was at the Threatened Species Recovery Hub, it was led by this amazing team here, and they went on to create the first Threatened Mammal Index and Threatened Plant Index. At the end of the Threatened Species Recovery Hub, it then transitioned to TERN. And in 2022, we updated all of the data that we had for the existing groups, so birds, mammals, and plants. Last year, we completed an update to the Threatened Bird Index. And this year, in addition to updating the data that we have for birds, mammals, and plants, we also aim to release a pilot of Australia's first Threatened Frog Index. Today, I'm going to be focusing on the 2023 release of the Threatened Plant Index. I'll show you some key findings and also of some key findings from analysis that we did on the underlying data set to look at the state of monitoring of threatened plants and near-threatened plants in Australia. All right, so this is the 2023 release of the Threatened Plant Index. So the data that we used for this particular index, we had data on 136 threatened and near-threatened plant taxa. We had 845 time series, and the data came from 78 data sources, so essentially data sets. So again, we have a reference year here of 1985 with a value of 1, and the value for 2020 was 0.28, which indicates there's been an average decline of threatened and near-threatened plants of 72% since 1985. And I've just included some of our collaborating partners down the bottom there too. All right, so we can also generate trends for different functional groups. So for example, here we've got the herbaceous functional group, so herbaceous plants. And I'll just point out that the reference year here is 1995. So herbaceous plants, we saw a decline of 84% since 1995. Orchids, there was a 47% decline since 1995. Shrubs, there was a 71% decline since 1995. For all the functional groups too, we can split it up into different states and territories and generate trends for these regions. So here we have New South Wales and ACT. Here the reference year is 2000, and so the reference year can vary depending on the data we have for that particular trend. So for New South Wales and ACT, we saw that there was a 51% decline since the year 2000. Victoria was an 89% decline, again since 2000. South Australia was a 42% decline. I'll just note here, though, that we didn't have data for 2020, so this index for South Australia goes up to 2019. And Western Australia had a 78% decline. And so I have not included the trends for Northern Territory, Queensland, or Tasmania, and that's because we have comparatively less data for those regions, with data on 4 taxa or less for each. Because we actually collect information about whether that site and or species is being managed for conservation, we can also filter for this information and generate trends, as I've done here. So, and we can see that for unmanaged sites, that there was a much steeper decline or greater decline since the reference year, which in this case is 1995, with a decline of 78% compared to managed sites, which had a decline of 45%. Diving a bit deeper now into the data that was used for the 2023 release of the Threatened Plant Index. So as I said, we had 78 data sources, or essentially data sets, and most of these, so 70, came from government, and we also had a few from academia and other sources. Looking at the plant taxa, so the index in 2023 included data for 9% of the species listed under the EPBC Act for plants. For priority species, we had data on 33% of those plants listed as national priority species, and that's as of 2024 in January, I should say. And I just included the 10 species that we have data for these priority species in that index. When we look at the locations of the surveys, so these particular sites, we can see we do have data for the Threatened Plant Index in 2023 from all the states and territories, but there is a bias towards the southeast. So, for example, Western Australia, sorry, that's the southeast, Victoria, New South Wales, South Australia. And there's also variation in the intensity of sampling. So in this map, we have in light blue was low sampling intensity and high is in pink. So there's variation across sites. And then looking closer at the number of time series and taxa. So here we've got in grey is the number of time series and green is number of taxa. So we see that the monitoring really took off in the 90s. For this particular index, we had the greatest number of time series and taxa between 2007 and 2017. After this point, and as we approach 2020, we do get a drop-off in data, and this is typical. It does take a while for data to come through to us and for us to extract data from publications. And for this reason, we implement a three-year lag. So for example, this year's index, the 2024 release, will include data up to 2021. So looking at the monitoring length, so specifically the time series length, so that's the time period from the first year of surveys to the last year of surveys, and this may include data gaps. So we found that the monitoring program length with the highest number of monitoring programs was 2 years, but there are also longer-term monitoring programs that brought that average time series length up to about 9.2 years. We can also look at monitoring consistency, specifically the time series sample years and time series completeness. So time series sample years, the average here was 4.1 years. For the time series completeness, so this is a proportional measure, so the number of years across the length of time series that contain samples. So if all the years across the time series had been sampled, that would give us a value of 1. Here we have an average of 0.6, and so these values indicate that we do have some data gaps across our surveys. When we look at the time series sampling evenness, so this is basically a low value indicates, even if there are gaps in our data set or across our time series, that they are evenly spread. So we found that this is 1.5, which is a relatively low value. However, there is considerable variation as well. We can just see this in our graph as well. So we've got on our y-axis, we have sites, so time series. And as I said, we had 845 sites, so that is time series, and a year on our x-axis. And if you read across, you can see that basically there's a dot in each year where we contain samples for that particular site. Thanks. Cool. All right, but yeah, of course there are benefits of long-term monitoring. So we need long-term monitoring to accurately estimate population trajectories, and this will enable us to make reliable assessments of conservation status. We need long-term monitoring to track species responses to environmental change. We can also use long-term monitoring to measure the effectiveness of our conservation management and actions in altering the trajectories of these species. We can use long-term monitoring to inform predictive models, such as population viability analyses. And it's also a great way to engage with citizen scientists as well. But I'm sure this is not news to you guys, but there are, of course, challenges in conducting long-term monitoring. First, is no surprise, is funding. Of course, there's a lot of threatened species that require funding, lots of projects, requires a lot of people power, resources, all that require money. Long-term monitoring is often driven by individuals, and often there's no good structure in place to keep those programs going once the individual can no longer continue it. There's also a focus on new groundbreaking research. An example of this is new methods. So while these are great, new improved methods are great, this would actually break a time series. So if at a particular site, if there was a new method, that would break a time series if those counts aren't comparable across years. There's also often a focus on publishing, which is an incentive for short-term monitoring. So for example, if once enough data has been collected for a research article, that site and/or species may not be monitored again in the future. Just some references and collaborating partners. And I would like to finish by asking for your help. So if you have monitoring data on threatened or near threatened species in Australia and would like to provide data to the index, please reach out to us. If you know someone who may have data, please tell them about the index. We're always looking to fill these data gaps. As I've shown today, we do have temporal, spatial, and taxonomic data gaps, so we're always looking for more data. I've just included the QR code for our TSX visualizer tool, so you can go on and generate different trends, look at different functional groups, and you can download the aggregated data there as well. We've got training resources, we've got training videos. We also want to make data provision as easy as possible, so we do also hold training workshops throughout the year. We're available for one-on-one consultations or group consultations, and of course, please come and see me this week if you're interested or want to know more. We do also have pamphlets outside on the table as well. All right, thank you so much.
Thanks, Sarah. And it's good to see the index has found a home in turn as well.